Edtech Monday Africa is brought to you by the MasterCard Foundation Center for Innovative Teaching and Learning in ICT and MasterCard Foundation's Young Africa Works. For our first Edtech Monday of 2022, we are happy to host the Rwanda State Minister of ICT and TVET and the team from the Spotlight series that will discuss education in the pandemic era, the role of technology. The Spotlight series, a partnership between the Global Education Monitoring Report and the Association for the Development of Education in Africa, ADEA, hosted by the African Development Bank, is analyzing the current situation in specific countries in Africa and on the steps taken towards achieving universal basic education completion and foundational learning in Africa to ensure the issue is on top of policymakers' agendas.
Well, it's 2022 and the world has entered the third year of the pandemic. So some of the issues we want to examine on EdTech Monday Africa edition are: is this the new normal for the world? Is this the new normal for education? What are the key lessons that we've learned over the past couple of years? What does 2022 look like in terms of digitalisation of education and education generally across the continent? We have an incredible panel joining us today. Claudette Irere, Minister of State in charge of ICT and TVET for Rwanda. Manos Antoninis, Senior Policy Analyst at UNESCO. And Albert Nsengiyumva, Executive Secretary of the Association for the Development of Education in Africa, ADEA. Thank you all for making time to be with us. COVID is still with us, and we're starting to understand as a world and as the continent that it may be that we need to embrace a new normal. And so, Minister, let me start with you. This is the third year of the pandemic. Schools have reopened across the continent. In-person learning is happening, by and large. But how is Rwanda thinking about education now? What have you had to pivot? What are the key learnings? How are you approaching education in this COVID era?
Thank you very much, Julie. Rwanda was also challenged, like many other countries, and we've experienced so many lockdowns, and alongside that, schools were closed. And so for the most of the time, I would say 2020, schools were really not working, not open. And while at the same time we were trying to be as proactive as possible in ensuring that we put content online, and I think that this is what all the other countries were doing as well, ensuring that you have content online that is still teachable, that is understood by both students and teachers. Ensuring that at least you use that time to ensure that teachers are trained, because this was a new way of teaching. And so they had, in one way or another, to be acquainted to the technology. And then the third thing was to ensure that, the devices have been dispatched all over the country are at good use. But like any other country, we also faced the shortage in device supply. And so this has not been an easy thing. So while the world was, grappling with this, we also decided to tackle, the biggest elephant in the room, which is the infrastructure. As you're aware, many of our students, and I think this applies to as many countries as well, we faced the overcrowding issue. And so we use this time to ensure that we look into the infrastructure so that once we reopen, we do not have our classes as packed as they were before. And so we've tried to do all these things all at once. While in the pandemic, while we were doing that, there are some great partners that came on board in a very surprising way. Telecom companies approached us and asked, what can we do? And so they offered to zero rate some of our content platforms so that students are able to continue accessing the content at zero fee. Secondly, yes, we worked at ensuring that content is there, and we've been working on revamping some of the platforms, which is equally important. Secondly, we thought that this was not enough. And so alongside radio, the broadcasters, national broadcasters, radio and TV, we put some of the courses, some of the classes on TV and on radio. So students that don't have access to these, smart devices where they can get the content, they were able to still follow, but also this is where parents play an important role, because students are not going to follow. Children at home are not going to go on TV and just watch some classes if parents don't come in and ensure and encourage the children to do so. Thirdly, we try to look at innovative ways of keeping the students engaged. And so we came up with some USSD codes, which USSD, again, anyone with either a feature phone or a smartphone, you can always access them. And this is, I would say that the continent is the biggest one to use USSD. And so we came up with some quizzes as well, different levels of education.
Thank you. Excellent contribution. I think such a powerful message. You are never prepared enough. And maybe that's why sometimes they say a crisis, actually, you need a crisis to drive true transformation, behavior change, mindset shifts, etc. Content, all important. Teachers need training. And this whole approach where they now are recruited through digital really helps them lean in to the training. What an incredible lesson there. Really powerful. Thank you for that. Let me come to you next, Manos. And really, before I go to learnings from your side and from the side of Albert and Adea, tell us a little bit more about the Spotlight series. What are you hoping to achieve? What's the end game with all this information and the learnings you're going to put together? What do you hope what the impact will be?
Thank you, Julie. The Spotlight report series is our attempt as a global report to zoom in and look with more detail into challenges that face individual regions. In the case of Africa, we wanted to look at the challenge of primary education and foundational learning. The fact that there has been a dramatic expansion of access to primary school. Still, 1 in 3 children do not finish primary school, which is a major obstacle to overcome. But those who do don't always get to learn what would be expected at that stage. So this is a challenge that predates the pandemic and will be with us after the pandemic. Perhaps some are worried that it will be coming back with a vengeance, as they say, in the sense that many children, not in all countries, but in many countries, have really been denied access to education over the past 2 years. So what we want to do is, and the government of Rwanda is one of those that have entrusted us with their participation as one of 5 focus countries in the first round, is first of all to add what we can. As a global report, we have that experience of collecting comparative information from different parts of the world and helping governments understand where things are on key education challenges. But we wanted to encourage countries to come up not only with their challenges, but also with their achievements. What are the areas in which they have worked successfully to improve learning conditions and learning outcomes for primary school age children? And that's the key, well, that's what we think could really help move things around, is to encourage countries to start talking to each other about precisely these achievements, so that countries learn from that experience of their peers and to mobilize that dialogue to another level, where there's even more attention to the key forces that help improve learning in primary education. And there's a range of them. First of all, there's the vision of governments. Do governments set as the priority that by a certain year, there will be many more children achieving minimum proficiency in reading and mathematics by the end of primary school. Right now, only 3 out of 10 at best reach such minimum proficiency by the end of primary. And that's only those who do reach the end, because as you remember, I mentioned that a lot do not. Do they align the pedagogy, what we know works for young children to learn, the curriculum, the textbooks, the language? There's so many parameters of the education content that really need to be also supportive. How are teachers prepared to take this difficult task? How are head teachers prepared? And that's a big gap in our knowledge. We know, for instance, that head teachers are not necessarily promoted or appointed because they have skills to lead other teachers to improve learning outcomes, specifically reading and mathematics. How are districts? In some countries, the role of the local offices, and Rwanda in particular with its decentralized approach, is very, very important. But how are they empowered and resourced to play that role? How are parents? That's another factor that really matters. How parents help. And we were talking about earlier, I think the minister said how important it was to ensure that parents motivated children to follow the lessons in television or radio. But that's only one part, right? The parents also need to be supportive of how children learn. And sometimes it's very difficult for them, especially if they themselves are not literate or they are first generation literate. And finally, how do governments, to tie it all together, how do they monitor and communicate the level of learning achievement? It is still a fairly new practice. Not all countries in the continent get it right to have data that tell them, they give them a good overview of what the situation is, that enables them to compare progress over time and feed that information back to the system, see where the curriculum could be strengthened, see how the textbooks could be strengthened, see how teachers can be better prepared for all those bottlenecks that the data show exist. So this is what we would like to achieve in this project, which is a partnership with ADEA, and it's a pleasure to share the panel with Albert, where we hope to mobilize continental forces to improve the situation, because often some of those discussions are externally based, but they have to be based in Africa, and solutions have to be found by the African governments themselves.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Manos. Very comprehensive overview of the Spotlight series. Let me come to you next, Albert, and you're working in partnership on this, of course. So important to understand the dynamics, get the data, the learnings, plug that back into a system of decision-making, next steps, and you are bringing all these stakeholders together. You have all these partnerships in place. I wonder, when you look at the ecosystem right now, and I'm going to come to technology in education in a moment, but first, when you look generally at how education is having to respond to this new normal that we live in, what are the things to you that keep you up at night? What are the things we need to solve that need to stay, front and center in terms of agendas for all the different stakeholders?
Thank you, Julie. Thank you to Honorable Minister who introduced these discussions, and to Manos as a partner on the Spotlight series. But your question is interesting because I think the minister touched on that. Technology and education in particular during this time of COVID-19 was put really to test. That's really a reality we need to acknowledge, because we need to acknowledge that it was not the first time that technology was applied to education. These things happened, so many years ago. We introduced technology in education, but I think at some point we did not realize that unless there's really a systemic approach in terms of introducing technology in education, we won't be able really to sustain the investment. I think that's really one reality that came up. So as an example, if we see the private sector getting interest to support education system in applying technology, to me, that's really a great achievement that nobody could actually expect. Because one of the challenges we have seen around the continent is that education and the private sector has never been able to create interactions that will actually support quality education and relevance. It is only around this time that we see some of these innovations happening, solutions are coming up. So I'm happy to see my predecessor saying something very important. Although COVID-19 is a crisis, but it's also an opportunity. It's a tremendous opportunity for people to reflect on the kind of work that we've been doing, the misconception that we had, and so on and so forth. I think that's the first lesson that we pick from this. And as we build back, I would like to build back better. Let's learn from our mistakes. Let's learn from our perceptions. Let's build a system that will allow us to be able to actually prevent and be prepared should there be any sort of crisis like COVID in the future. So in nutshell, there are 3 or 4 important things that we are learning out of this time. First, education indeed, it's so important to African countries or elsewhere because it's a social equalizer. One of the challenges that we are facing that we realize the COVID-19 has exacerbated the issues that we had before, but we are learning them much now because this is the first time that I see much emphasis on the well-being, for example. We know we need to invest in well-being. And in investing in the well-being, we are bringing other stakeholders that were not actually seen as important before. So we are looking at how to engage with the health sector, for example, how to engage with technology companies, even though before that it used to happen, but not the way that we see it today. We look at how to make sure that we feed our children while at school. So all those shows really we are creating more and more a momentum to bring in other stakeholders because education is now at the central. Education is really on crisis, but it's also on central. So that's really number one. Number two is what I mentioned about the systemic approach. I remember 10, 15 years ago, whenever we talk about ICT in education, the focus was really on the hard and soft infrastructure. So we were discussing about how to reach out schools by giving them connectivity. And I'm happy to hear from the minister. Now we are looking at how do we make sure a teacher master technology in order to transform the teaching? How do we make sure that the parents are playing their parts? Because a school today, although it happens in a classroom, but it goes even beyond at home. So the continuation of learning becomes so critical. How do we integrate learning assessment using technology? So this is what I feel it's so important because we are tackling everything more or less like what I call the building blocks to provide quality and relevant education. And last not least, I think we are also looking at how best country can invest better. You see, there's investment required. We are about actually to launch a study looking at the current situation analysis of ICT in education in a number of African countries. As I said before, countries have been heavily investing into infrastructure, into devices. Now, I think the value lies into the materials. How do we transform these learning materials to be accessible in teaching and learning, to support teaching and learning? How do we invest more in making sure that we actually connect with the demand side, the labor market, because that's also equally important. We are seeing mismatch between demand and supply. How technology can help us to be able to collect useful data that will inform our curriculum and teaching. So those are some of the kind of issues that I feel we are in a better position today to address as we prepare to rebuild back better. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Just a fascinating discussion. I want to pose a question around what are we aiming for? What are our where are we placing our standards as we look forward and as we reimagine education for Africa? I was reading the words of the former president of Tanzania, the late former president, many decades ago, saying that it's not just about Africa standing on its feet. Africa could be, for the rest of the world, you know, an incredible lesson. We could be independent, but also able to teach the rest of the world you know, it fascinated me. I look at mobile money. We all know what mobile money has achieved in Africa. And so, you know, the opportunities around digital in Africa, massive. Where are we placing our standards, our expectations for education, and knowing that we have such a young growing population? How bold are we in our thinking? Minister Claudette, let me come to you. Are we able to get it right for our people on the continent, but also show the world a new pathway for education? Can we get there?
Thank you, Julie. I think Africa has been known to leapfrog, you know, where others have taken years to, you know, move from one technology to another. Africa has always jumped, and for some reason, it seems to be working. And when you look at other technologies, for instance, I think yesterday I was with friends and we were talking about mobile money in Africa. Everyone walks around with their phone because they know that's like their banking tool. Whereas, you know, in other parts of the world, it's still, you know, sometimes still have to carry money. And yes, they do have other technologies, but there is that part of leapfrogging. And so I believe that as Africa, we can still make it. Of course, we're challenged, you know, resources being some of them, being some of the challenges that we face, you know, a competent workforce when it comes to digital technologies, our population that still needs a little bit of, you know, change of mindset, but also educating them around these new things, these new technologies to use. But I believe that as a collective, looking at the young population that we have, which is so good at adopting many of these new technologies. I think if we were able to work as a collective and ensure that what we're doing is actually cutting across, you know, from north to south, I think we can do this. And if we are to talk about, you know, when you look at AFCFTA, for instance, if we are going to be able to do that, it will require that we're integrated, that our citizens as well have been brought up to understand what integration means. And if we get to a point where even if I'm Rwandan, I can go and work in Egypt, I can go and work elsewhere, just because I have the right kind of skill set and I'm exposed enough to these technologies, then this is a possibility. But I would say, you know, in all humility, that we still have a long way to go, that leadership, most importantly, will need to start looking at digital technologies and education. And I think it's Albert that just said it, that there's no one without the other, you know, that these are things that have to move together. And we start investing in these things. We invest in other infrastructure. We invest in so many other things. But if we start looking at digital technologies as a priority, just as many others, I think as a collective, we can do this. I like that you brought up Mwalimu Nyerere and what he really thought of, Africa and how he portrayed it, in the face of everyone, really. And I think if we were to work and, having Mwalimu Nyerere's thoughts in mind, if we were driven with ensuring that every child in Africa is given opportunity to go to school, I think that's a first. Because if you ensure that children go to school, ensuring that schools are equipped with the right kind of, tools, ensuring that the teachers have the right kind of skills to deliver on the lessons using the technology, ensuring that you create an environment around this child that really allows them to get the kind of exposure that they need. And if we were all working towards that, then we will have a child that is exposed from a very young age and that gets out in the world to be the best version that they can be. And so I think it's a matter of willingness and commitment and seeing technology as a priority and never looking at technology aside and education aside. These are things that have to go hand in hand going forward. And COVID has shown us that really this is the only way to go. And if we are progressing in a world where these two are still separated, then we're lying to ourselves. Let me pause here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. We cannot approach these in silos. They walk hand in hand in this new normal of ours. Let me come back to you, Albert, before I come to Manos, and just say, Minister Claudette shared a great example with us of recruiting on digital platforms. And that is so effective to getting teachers then to really fully immerse themselves in understanding this digital environment. Do you have some other great examples of how we really should be using digital, what has worked on the continent? And then Manos, I come to you with the same question, maybe with a wider lens. Are there any interesting things that have happened at global level that we could learn from as well? So Albert, let me start with you.
Thank you. And I'm actually building from what Minister Claudette was touching on. What we are learning out of this is if you put technology in the hands of these young people, you get incredible results. So that's clear. So exposure is so important. We need to expose, we need to provide access and also challenge our young people. So a simple example, and which is actually driven by MasterCard Foundation, one of your centers, is around this innovation competition. So I was looking at some of these applications that are being developed by young people from Kenya to Nigeria to Rwanda. Incredible. They're developing edtech solutions, And the question I'm asking myself, and I was asking one of the responsible of the initiative, is one thing to these young people to promote best practices and innovation. But how do we make sure there are accompanying measures so that we move from just a solution to something that is much bigger, to become more or less like a service that they can offer on cost-based, using a cost-based approach. So how do we support them? I fully support whatever that has said that the continent is changing just because the leadership has realized unless we invest in these young people, we empower them, there's no way we can actually proceed and actually expand. But how do we make sure that there is actually the whole value chain from supporting the initial startup, facilitating access to finance, and allowing them to actually compete globally? Because this is what the technology is telling us. There's no frontier with technology as long as you have the right solution that meets the needs of people. So I was speaking an example of this EdTech, the innovations hub that are coming up in Rwanda, in Kenya, in Nigeria. How can we continue promoting that? To me, that's really a wonderful initiative. Number two, we are, together with other partners, we are working on one of the initiatives to try and be able to use some of these materials that have been used in the past how do you digitize them so that they are actually part of the platform, they can be reused? The reuse of innovative technologies and putting them in the platforms. So that's also another opportunity. So technology is there as a tool. The question is, how best can we apply to respond to some of our needs and be able to use as a business opportunity? So examples are really immense. And I'm happy that you mentioned about the mobile money. It's incredible. I was telling somebody yesterday, sitting at home, I'm able to buy anything using one of these codes. In Kigali, they have this system where you put a code and then you pay anything that you want to pay. So you see, those are actually the potential opportunities that the technology offer. The question, I think, Minister Claudette was alluding to this, how leadership in each of our countries takes the opportunity of this kind to make sure that we actually support our young people to perform and to be able to translate whatever solutions into opportunities for jobs, because that's what we're talking about. How do we give jobs to our young people? And technology is there to support that. Thank you.
Thank you. And yes, mobile money has opened many pathways. I'm in a far-flung part of Kenya and able to do a lot online, just using mobile technology for money transfer, etc., not needing to go to a bank. If we can achieve this revolution in education, it would mean so much for this continent. And thank you for mentioning the work of the Regional Center for Innovative Teaching and Learning. And if you want to know more about this, please do go to the web address on the screen now and learn about the work, which really focuses on driving the innovative use of technology to improve teaching and learning in education, with a focus on secondary education, but please do go and learn more there. So Manos, let me come to you now. Lessons, what can we learn, adapt, integrate into our new pathway for education?
Well, there is no doubt that technology is developing rapidly, and we have to embrace it. But I think it's also important to have our feet on the ground and remember and maybe adjust our policies that there are also opportunities that are highly unequally distributed. Let's not forget, for instance, radio and television instruction. Well, we know that at the beginning of the crisis, among the poorest fifth of the population in a country like Ethiopia, only 7% owned a radio. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, only 8%. In Madagascar, 14%. Even in Kenya, only 30% of the poorest had a radio. None of those groups in these four countries owned a television. And that's an important thing before we even move to other forms of technology. In Sierra Leone, which actually is an important thing to say, when COVID struck Europe, there was panic because societies are sometimes not that resilient as they are in Africa. Sierra Leone and of course its neighboring countries had this experience of the Ebola outbreak, and they were therefore much more resilient, ready to accommodate challenges. So for instance, Sierra Leone had the interactive radio programming already in place that could even accommodate local languages. So teachers were retrained, the curriculum was adjusted. So that was a really good practice. But the reality was that still only 1/3 of students had access to radio lessons, and the children from the wealthier families had 3 times more opportunity to tune in than those from poorer families. So one good response was to at least make transmitters available for universal coverage. So sometimes the problem boils down to infrastructure, basic infrastructure that will make accessibility a reality for children and their families. Let's also not forget that Africa consists of primarily low and lower middle income countries. In lower middle income countries, access to the internet at home was only a reality for 14% of the population. In low income countries, 14% of the wealthiest had access to internet at home. that highlights the magnitude of the challenge. Education, television and radio programs were most popular in the countries like Burkina Faso, for instance, where 40% of households reported that their children following them. That means 6 out of 10 did not, right? So let us not forget that. No child reported following radio program in a country like Mali. Instead, 1 in 3 children continued their learning through teacher assignments, so at the local level, so no technology involved. And perhaps what is most striking, at least for those of us who observe the huge potential of mobile phones, and let's not forget that the data that we have for what has happened in Africa, but also around the world during the pandemic are quite limited because many of our traditional sources of information broke down. But one type of source that flourished during this period was phone surveys. And these have provided some interesting insights, but also some rather sobering messages. The use of mobile learning applications received much media attention, but was the least common remote learning approach, used by no more than 17% of children in Nigeria and 12% in Ethiopia, but by barely any in countries like Malawi or Uganda. So that's all to say that there is huge potential, but for that potential to be realized, the infrastructure conditions really need to improve rapidly. And that's a priority for all governments in the continent. Of course, the government of Rwanda has been one of the champions, understanding early on that this is an area that really needs to be improved.
Thank you. You know, that response brings me to my final question, really, which was, what are the critical things that we need to achieve this year? If you said these are the 1-2 things that I need to do this year, or that I need to work on with partners, etc., to really ensure that education is working in Africa, that EdTech, is working for Africa for this year, what is absolutely critical to ensuring education is working and EdTech, as we've been told, we need to see them as one now, is working for Africa? Albert?
Interesting question. Huh? So to me, I think what we are learning out of these discussions, there's a clear understanding on the importance to revisit education. There's a clear understanding of the importance of applying technologies. So that's clear. I think the momentum is here. Some countries are far compared to others, that's clear, but there's really a good understanding on that. So the next thing that I would like to focus is to make sure that there are standards and norms in place in terms of applying technology in education. So we are piloting one of these in 10 countries where we come up with norms and standards to facilitate integration of technology in education, looking at different ways. And the key thing is, how do we facilitate remote learning? Because as I said, we are learning out of the crisis. So how do we make sure that should there be a new crisis, we are prepared? So that's really number one that we are focusing on, and we could actually be able to publish whatever best practices that we're learning from countries. Number two is to promote effective investment in education and in EdTech in particular. So as I said, there's a clear understanding that countries are looking to invest, as the minister was mentioning, in infrastructure, training of teachers, equipment, and so on and so forth. How do we come up with more or less like a roadmap that will facilitate countries to engage in effective investment in promoting technology to support quality education? So that's really another thing that I want to say. So the last one is now to promote what we call digitalisation. We've been really embarked in this new undertaking, new thinking about how digitalisation inform the reforms we want to see at different level of education. Because digitalization is important for basic education, it's important to technical vocational, it's important to higher education. How do we promote this idea about revisiting the way our kids learn, the way our teachers teach, the way we connect with the labor market through this digitalized world. So to me, those are really the three quick ideas that come in my mind, but they feel to be the priority for this year. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Very, very clear. Manos?
Well, I guess we just have to hope that it might be the third year, but might not be a full third year of disruption, that actually children find their way back to school. We just heard that in Uganda, schools reopened after 2 years, so maybe one of the last countries to do so. So we hope that the normality will return in the next few months throughout the continent. But let's not lose the opportunity to continue practicing the lessons from technology and carry out investments throughout this year so that we are better prepared next time. Because everyone keeps saying, and of course we have seen that in many countries in Africa before for other health emergencies or other emergencies, that such conditions will happen again. So we have to be better prepared. But let's also capitalize on the thirst African nations have for education. The early signs that we have received is that there is no early school leaving after the pandemic. That actually, the one challenge is that children may be repeating classes, which is a risk, because the more children repeat, the more likely they might be to be dropping out of school earlier than expected. But they do return to school. Evidence from Ghana, from Senegal, from Ethiopia suggests that they do. So let's capitalize on that, and let's not forget equity. One of the key messages that the report keeps having is that a focus on foundational skills is a sign of commitment to equity. And it's true that African governments are constrained by their financial resources, which means they leave relatively little to play around in order to target some of these resources to the poorest families. But that should be a key part of the challenge, because often we are inspired to do the latest, the fanciest, the most future-oriented solution, but that is a risk for those who may be left behind. And I think governments have an obligation to care about everyone. Yes, we need to experiment with technology. We need to continue experimenting because we got a very strong message that we cannot ignore it. But at the same time, let's not forget that there are foundational problems to be resolved, because only after resolving them will we be able to build economies in Africa that are skills-oriented and can exploit the opportunities that are coming. As you say, Africa is the place where all opportunities are going to be open in the next few years.
Thank you for that, Manos. And the message I'm getting from you is focus on foundational issues, skills, problems. Don't lose sight of that. And we remain optimistic. We really do. We finish with you, Minister. Your final word as you look forward. What is top of mind for you? What do you really want to achieve this year?
To answer your question, I think there are, I'm going to summarize it in about 4 points. The first one would be for education systems, across the board, to design programs. Here I'm talking about curriculum and everything else that goes around teaching and learning, and that are inclusive of digital. Without that, then you're not able to even know what kind of infrastructure should I be investing in, what kind of devices am I bringing, to what level. So the second item is investing now into the infrastructure and of course services that are supportive of this. And here, there's a range depending on what you've identified across the board. For us, we have general education, but we also have polytechnics. We have TVET schools that would slightly require a different way of thinking when you're talking about digital for them. And then the third, which I think is critical and important, is to start looking into reforms and reforms that would bring in regulations to help these education systems, the execution efficient execution, but also enforcement. Here, what I'm alluding to, that we're not going to achieve what we want to achieve with the same mindset, the traditional mindset. If we are to bring in digital, then we will need to, bring in a new department or bring in a new, do reforms that will allow execution, but also regulation and enforcement. For instance, if we hadn't started I think you kept referring to this example that I gave of teacher recruitment. We know across the board that teachers, even if you train them every day, all day, the tuition rate, the attrition rate is always high because teachers are going into other jobs. But if you require them to come in the job already trained, already with the right kind of skills, and enforce that, because yes, they're not going to be able to interact with any education platform if they don't have the right skills, then those are the kind of reforms that need to happen. Those are the kind of things that you need to put in place. Last but not least, which I think is equally important and alludes to what Manos was saying, we cannot, overlook other important elements. Physical infrastructure. Here I'm talking about the classrooms, because you're not going to teach digitally just for that. You will still need to bring students in class, and we will need to keep doing that. And then the emotional and the welfare of the teaching workforce. This has also been proven to be important, because if you don't invest in the teachers and the workforce, they are not going. You cannot give what you don't have, and then they need to feel that they are valued, that this whole journey has them included, and that there are critical elements to making this a success. And so their welfare, their training, their building their capacity, but also looking at the emotional side. And I think emotional intelligence has always been proven to be important. I think these four are elements that I think are critical to ensure that are done in the short term. Everything else can come after, everything else can be part of these, but if you put these things in place at the very start and start building towards that, then I'm sure we will come back here next year talking about a different story. Thank you.
Thank you so much. A really, really rich conversation. Really appreciate all your time for this. And I'm going away with the words that the minister shared. You are never prepared enough. And they say in a crisis, prepare as much as you possibly can. And it has to be said, COVID or no COVID, so many students, young people were left behind in our education systems on the continent that we needed a new approach. And perhaps this crisis heralded an opportunity for all of us to come together and say these two walk hand in hand. Digitalization, education, absolutely critical, must be done. And clearly we are building a very, very good understanding, whether it's government or other stakeholders, of how we want to walk forward. Thank you all for your time. Thank you for joining us as well. We would love your views, and earlier had asked what your thoughts are on education technology and 2022. What needs to be done? Let's see what you had to say. Thank you so much for joining the show, and we'll be back again in 4 weeks' time. Do follow the handles on your screen now to continue conversations online around education, technology, and Africa. It's been a pleasure. See you again next month.
Edtech Monday Africa was brought to you by the MasterCard Foundation's Center for Innovative Teaching and Learning in ICT and MasterCard Foundation's Young Africa Works.